I'm Ashley, and I never imagined how drastically my life would alter in a single year. I can't help but chuckle when I think back on how foolish I was about what I believed to be my ideal marriage. I married Robert 4 years ago when I was 30 years old. We appeared to be a match made in heaven. At Richardson Financial, I was working as a project manager and moving up the corporate ladder. Robert was happy in his role at TradeWorks as a manager. Robert wanted a more straightforward life than the husbands of many of my coworkers who were always vying for advancements. He would prepare dinner, arrive home early, and spend peaceful evenings with me. He never appeared to mind that I made more money than he did. He actually appeared to take pleasure in having a prosperous wife. Almost every Friday he would welcome me with a kiss and say, "Honey, I made your favorite pasta tonight," as I entered the room, worn out from yet another demanding week of deadlines and meetings. I would respond, "You spoil me too much," as I inhaled the familiar aroma of herbs and garlic that permeated our rental home. We had our shared dreams, our inside jokes, and our routines. As we saved for our own home, the joint account continued to increase gradually. We had already saved $200,000. We were getting there, but not quite enough for our ideal house. Robert would say, "We'll have our own place soon," as he went through the real estate listings on his phone as we were snuggled together on the couch. I would agree and think about our future together. Just another year or two of saving, I would say. We discussed having children in the future, but we both decided to hold off until we had a home of our own. Everything appeared so certain, so plain. Then that March Tuesday arrived. Though I was unaware of it at the time, it was the day that everything began to fall apart, which is why I can still clearly recall it. The room began to spin as I was in the middle of giving the board quarterly projections. Before everything went dark, I heard someone yelling my name as the faces around the conference table became blurry. Surrounded by worried looks and the constant beep of monitors, I awoke at the emergency department. Beside my bed, a graying-haired doctor with gentle eyes held a clipboard. "Mrs. Parker," he said gently, "we need to run some additional tests, but the preliminary scan shows something concerning. There appears to be a mass in your brain." The word mass echoed in my head like a death sentence. I felt my world tilting again, but this time I remained conscious, painfully aware of every word that followed. "We'll need to do more extensive testing to determine if it's benign and if surgery is possible," the doctor continued. "I need to be honest with you. Even if surgery is an option, there's a significant risk of long-term disability." I nodded mechanically, my mind already racing to Robert. How would he take this news? Would he stay by my side if I became disabled? We had promised in sickness and in health, but this was different. This was real. I took a cab home from the hospital that evening, my mind racing with how to break the news to Robert. When I opened our front door, I found him in the kitchen, humming while stirring something that smelled like beef stew. The normalcy of it all made my heart ache. "Robert," I called out softly, still standing in the doorway, "I need to tell you something." He turned around with a spoon in hand and must have seen something in my face because the smile immediately dropped from his. "What's wrong, Ash?" I told him everything. The fainting spell, the hospital, the tumor. His face grew increasingly pale as I spoke, but what happened next caught me completely off guard. "Will you be able to keep working?" he asked, setting down the spoon. "What happens if you have to quit? Do we have enough money?" I stood there stunned. My husband had just learned I might be dying or face permanent disability, and his first concern was about money, about my ability to work. "We have our savings," I managed to reply, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. "It should be enough to get us through the initial period. We can figure out the rest later, right?" Right. He nodded, running his hands through his hair. The savings. Okay. The next few weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments and tests. I tried to maintain my normal work schedule, but it became increasingly difficult. The headaches were getting worse, and some days I could barely focus on my computer screen. "Ashley, you need to take some time off," my boss, Sarah Mitchell, finally said after finding me with my head in my hands one afternoon. "We can arrange for 6 months of medical leave. Your health has to come first." I knew she was right, but being at home all day was harder than I expected. The walls seemed to close in on me as I lay on the couch, wondering if each day might be one of my last. Would I die? Would I survive but never be the same? The questions tormented me endlessly. And then there was Robert's changing behavior. He started coming home later and later, sometimes well past midnight. When I asked him about it, he'd always have the same response. "I'm picking up extra shifts, Ash. We need the money for your treatment. You understand, right?" I'd nod, too exhausted from my own fears to probe further. Sometimes I'd hear him on the phone in another room, speaking in hushed tones. But I told myself he was probably just dealing with work stuff. My mind was occupied with darker thoughts. What would happen if the tumor was malignant? If I survived but ended up paralyzed? Would Robert stick around to take care of a disabled wife? After weeks of trying to handle everything on my own, I finally broke down and called my mother. I'd been avoiding it, not wanting to worry her at her age. She'd had me late in life and was now in her 70s. But I needed her more than I'd ever needed her before. "Mom," I said when she answered the phone, my voice cracking. "I'm sick." As soon as I explained everything, she didn't hesitate. "I'm coming over right now, sweetheart. Pack my bag this minute." She arrived the next day. I was having one of my bad days, barely able to make it from the bedroom to the bathroom without getting dizzy. She took one look at me and switched into full mother mode, just like when I was a little girl with the flu. Having Mom there was like being wrapped in a warm blanket. She cooked, cleaned, made sure I took my medications on time, and most importantly, held my hand during the worst moments when the fear became overwhelming. But not everyone was happy about her presence. Robert's face would tighten every time he came home and found her there. He'd force a smile and retreat to the bedroom or suddenly remember work emails he had to send. "Your mother doesn't have to stay here all the time," he said one night when we were alone. "I can take care of you." "But you're hardly ever home anymore," I pointed out. "Because I'm working," he snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "I'm working for us, Ash." Mom noticed the tension, too. After 2 weeks, she announced she was heading home. "You seem stronger now, sweetheart," she said, though I could tell she was reluctant to leave. "But I'm just a phone call away if you need me." The next few weeks were a blur of medical tests and clinic visits. The house felt empty without Mom, and Robert was spending even more time away. But I forced myself to focus on my health, on getting through each day, on hoping for good news. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got it. At my latest appointment, my doctor was actually smiling as he looked at my test results. "Mrs. Parker, I have good news," he said, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "The tumor is benign, and it's in a location where we can safely operate. The risk of complications is minimal." I burst into tears of relief. After all these weeks of uncertainty and fear, there was hope, real hope. I couldn't wait to tell Robert. Maybe now things could go back to normal. Maybe all his strange behavior had just been stress about my condition. I practically floated out of the hospital, already planning how I would tell him the good news. I decided to head straight home, hoping to catch him before he left for work. I quietly inserted my key into the lock, but before I could open the door fully, I heard his voice from inside. He was talking loudly on the phone, apparently not expecting anyone home at this hour. "I can't take it anymore, Sarah. You don't know what it's like living with her," he was saying, his voice filled with disgust. The constant smell of medicines in the house, her sickly appearance, it's just unbearable. My hand froze on the doorknob as he continued. I know, but you should see her now. She's nothing like the woman I married. Always weak, always complaining about headaches. I'm too young to be playing nurse to an invalid." Each word felt like a physical blow. I stood there, listening to my husband disparage me to another woman, my legs trembling beneath me. Yeah, the money situation is being handled. We've got quite a bit in savings. Look, I'll figure something out. I just need to get out of this situation before she gets worse. I pushed the door open fully and stepped into the room. Robert spun around, the phone still pressed to his ear, his face draining of color when he saw me. "I'll call you back," he mumbled into the phone, ending the call. What was that all about? My voice came out steadier than I expected. For a moment, Robert just stared at me, caught off guard. Then his expression shifted, hardened. "Well, I guess you heard everything," he said, straightening his shoulders. "Maybe it's better this way. We need to talk." "Talk about what?" I asked, though I already knew what was coming. "I want a divorce, Ashley. And I want half of our savings," he said it so matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. "Let's be realistic. You're sick, and I'm not going to spend the best years of my life taking care of an invalid. I need someone young, healthy. I deserve that." I stood there, absorbing his words, thinking about the good news I just received from the doctor. But looking at Robert now, I realized it wouldn't make any difference. This wasn't about my illness. It was about who he really was. "We need to do this quickly," he continued, gaining confidence from my silence. "Before your surgery. I'm not risking being legally tied to a disabled person if something goes wrong." "Fine," I said quietly. I agree to the divorce. He seemed surprised by my quick agreement, perhaps expecting tears or pleading. "Good," he said, recovering quickly. "I'll go to a hotel tonight. I don't want to stay here anymore. I'll come back tomorrow to pack my things." "That's probably best," I replied, my voice hollow. Robert grabbed his jacket and wallet, not even bothering to pack an overnight bag. At the door, he paused for a moment, like he might say something else. Then he shook his head and left. After Robert left, I stood in our living room for what felt like hours, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. Finally, I decided to start packing his things. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing him again tomorrow. As I moved around the house gathering his belongings, my eyes fell on his laptop, still open on the dining room table. I'd never been the type to snoop through my husband's things, but something compelled me to look at the screen. What I found made my knees buckle, and I had to grab the back of a chair for support. There, in full view, was a series of intimate messages between Robert and Sarah. As I scrolled through their conversation history, my stomach turned. There were explicit photos, intimate details of their encounters, and worst of all, cruel jokes about me. "Poor sick Ashley," Sarah had written. "At least her condition gives us more time together." "God, you should see her now," Robert replied. "She looks like death warmed over. I can barely stand to look at her anymore." My hands were shaking as I continued scrolling, but what I found next made me gasp out loud. There was another conversation thread, this one with Amanda Wilson, my husband's boss's wife. The messages between them were equally intimate, filled with declarations of love and plans for secret meetings. "Does your husband suspect anything?" Robert had asked her. "John, clueless as always," she replied. too busy with work to notice what's happening under his nose. I felt sick, but I forced myself to keep reading. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of everything: the messages, the photos, the timestamps. Something in me knew this might be important later. The divorce proceedings moved quickly after that. We didn't have much to untangle: no children, no property of our own. The house was rented, and our only joint asset was our savings account. With the $200,000 we'd been saving for a down payment on a house, money that had come primarily from my higher salary, though I'd never minded that imbalance before. Robert's lawyer, a shark in an expensive suit, had other ideas. "Your Honor," he argued during the proceedings, "while Mrs. Parker may have contributed more directly to the savings account, my client's contributions to the household were equally valuable. He managed all domestic duties, allowing Mrs. Parker to focus on her career. The money he earned went directly to household expenses, groceries, utilities, daily necessities." I watched as Robert nodded sullenly beside his lawyer, playing the role of the devoted house husband who'd sacrificed his own career advancement for our home. The same man who'd called me a burden just weeks before. The judge agreed with their argument. The court finds that both parties contributed equally to the marriage, albeit in different ways. The savings will be divided equally between Mr. and Mrs. Parker. Just like that, half of our savings, $100,000, went to Robert. The money I'd worked so hard to save, stayed late at the office, taken on extra projects, was now being split with the man who'd betrayed me in every possible way. After the divorce was finalized, Robert moved out immediately. I couldn't stay in that apartment either. Too many memories, too much pain. My mother welcomed me home with open arms, just as she had when I was a scared teenager after my first breakup. 2 months after the divorce, I finally had my surgery. The procedure went exactly as the doctors had hoped. They successfully removed the tumor, and my recovery began immediately. Each day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like my old self. During my recovery, I stayed with my mother. She was my rock, just as she'd always been. But I started noticing she seemed more tired than usual. One evening, as we sat in her cozy living room drinking tea, she took my hand. "Ashley, sweetheart, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've made a decision about my future. I found a wonderful nursing home, Sunset Gardens. It's peaceful, has excellent care, and I've already paid for my stay there." She squeezed my hand. "I want to spend my remaining years somewhere I won't be a burden." "Mom, you're not a burden." "Let me finish," she interrupted with a smile. "I've thought this through. The house will be yours, along with my savings, about $300,000. You deserve a fresh start after everything you've been through." I tried to argue, but Mom had that determined look I knew so well. A week later, I helped her move into Sunset Gardens. The place was beautiful, with gardens and activities, and Mom seemed genuinely excited about this new chapter in her life. After getting her settled, I returned to what was now my house. It felt strange being there alone, but also peaceful. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. Life has a funny way of serving up moments of perfect timing. About a month after Mom's move, I was sitting in my favorite cafe, enjoying a quiet lunch break when I heard a familiar voice. "Ashley, is that really you?" I looked up to see Robert's mother, Margaret, standing by my table, her face pale as if she'd seen a ghost. "Hello, Margaret," I said, gesturing for her to sit. "I can't believe it," she stammered. "Robert told us you were terminally ill," she said, trailing off, looking embarrassed. I couldn't help but laugh. "He told you I was dying." "Well, as you can see, I'm very much alive, still working at Richardson Financial, actually." "And Mom just left me her house. I'm planning to sell it and buy an apartment closer to work. Margaret's face went through a series of emotions before settling on something between shame and satisfaction. You know, she said, leaning forward, Robert's living with me now. That woman he left you for, Sarah, she took every penny he got from the divorce and then left him. He's got nothing now. I took a slow sip of my coffee, hiding my smile behind the cup. I didn't need to say anything. Margaret's tone told me she was as disgusted with her son's behavior as I was. He made his bed, she added, shaking her head. Now he has to lie in it. As I watched Margaret leave the cafe, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I hadn't wished ill on Robert. I'd been too busy focusing on my own recovery to think much about him at all. But knowing that karma had dealt him such a perfect hand of justice, well, I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. I was sorting through some old photos in my mother's living room when I heard aggressive pounding on the front door. Before I could even get up, the door burst open, and there stood Robert, his face red with anger and something else, desperation. "You lied to me," he shouted, storming into the house like he still had a right to be there. "My mother told me everything. You're completely fine." I stood up slowly, keeping the coffee table between us. "Get out of my house, Robert." "Your house." He laughed bitterly. "The house your mother conveniently left you after our divorce, along with all that money." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing but now saw as theatrical. "Ashley, baby, I made a mistake. I was scared and stupid. I still love you. We can start over." "Love me?" I felt a cold anger rising in my chest. "You're a traitor, Robert. You abandoned me when I was sick. You cheated on me. I want nothing to do with you." "Why didn't you tell me you were getting better?" he demanded. "Why didn't you tell me about your mother's plans to leave you all this?" His voice cracked with what he probably thought was emotion, but I recognized his grief. "You want to know why?" I stepped closer to him. "The day I found out my tumor was benign, the day I rushed home to tell you the good news, was the same day I heard you on the phone with your mistress, talking about what a burden I was." He had the decency to flinch at that, but recovered quickly. "That's not fair, Ashley. You deliberately hid your mother's inheritance from me during the divorce. Half of all this belongs to me by law." "No, it doesn't," I said firmly. "Mom left me this inheritance after our divorce was final. You have no claim to it." He was shouting now, his face getting redder. "You knew this was coming. You and your mother planned this. You hid assets during our divorce proceedings. That's illegal. I'll sue you, Ashley. I'll take you to court and prove that you deliberately concealed future assets during our divorce. You'll have to give me half of everything." I stood in my mother's living room, watching Robert's tirade with a calmness that seemed to infuriate him even more. When he finally paused for breath, I walked to my desk, pulled out my phone, and pulled up the photos I'd saved months ago. "Before you continue threatening me," I said quietly, "I think you should see something." I held up my phone, showing him the screenshots of his conversations with Amanda Wilson, his boss's wife. The color drained from his face. "You remember Amanda, don't you? Your boss, Don's wife." I scrolled through the messages slowly, letting him see every damning detail. I wonder what Don would think about these messages, about the photos, about all those lunch breaks she spent with his wife while claiming to work overtime. "You wouldn't," he whispered, but his voice had lost all its previous bravado. "I'm trying to recover from a serious illness, Robert. I don't need this stress. I don't need your threats. I don't need you bursting into my house making demands." I locked my phone and set it down. "Leave me alone or Don gets copies of everything. Your choice." He stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, he backed toward the door. "You've changed," he said accusingly. "No, Robert, I just stopped being afraid." After he left, I sat down and cried, not from sadness or fear, but from relief. It was truly over. The next few months were transformative. I sold my mother's house for an excellent price, thanks to the hot real estate market. With that money and the inheritance, I bought a beautiful apartment in a luxury building just 3 blocks from my office. The walk to work became my daily therapy, helping me rebuild my strength step by step. The illness had taken its toll on my body. I'd lost nearly 20 lbs during the worst of it, but slowly I began to recover. I started taking yoga classes in my building's fitness center, gradually rebuilding my strength and flexibility. My appetite returned, and with it my energy. I couldn't have asked for more understanding from my boss. She encouraged me, "Take all the time you need," during my first week back. "We're just glad to have you back with us." She made arrangements for me to work flexible hours so that I could go stress-free to my therapy sessions and follow-up appointments. Sometimes, on my morning walks to work, I catch my reflection in the sleek glass buildings and barely recognize myself. Not because of the weight loss or the small scar hidden beneath my hair, but because of the confidence in my stride, the straightness of my spine, the lift of my chin. I had changed from being the lady who had feared loneliness, illness, and unlove. I sometimes got tidbits of information about Robert through mutual contacts. After blowing through his divorce settlement with Sarah, he was still living with his mother. I never inquired as to whether he quit or was fired, but it seemed that he had to leave his position at TradeWorks. It was no longer relevant. At Sunset Gardens, my mother flourished, pursuing watercolor painting and forming new friendships. Every Sunday when I went to see her, we would sit in the garden, sipping tea and discussing everything and nothing. She never reminded me that she had misgivings about Robert from the beginning, nor did she ever say, "I told you so." Rather, Mom would say, "You're blooming, sweetheart," while grinning proudly at me. She was correct. I was flowering, just like the potted orchid my coworkers gave me as a welcoming gift on the ledge of my new apartment. I hadn't been destroyed by the divorce, the tumor, or the betrayal. I had been made stronger by them.